If you can't force your mind to learn, watch this. Feynman's secret: picture an empty classroom, rows of chairs aligned with military precision, the kind of silence that feels like pressure. On the blackboard, equations nobody understands. In the air, the residue of 1,000 lectures that entered through ears and vanished before reaching anything resembling comprehension. This is where millions of people come every single day, armed with discipline, furnished with willpower, determined to force their minds to learn. And this is where, every single day, they fail. Not because they lack effort, not because they're lazy or stupid or undisciplined. They fail because they're trying to do something that cannot be done. You cannot force a mind to learn, and the harder you try, the more certainly you guarantee that no real learning will ever occur. This is the paradox that Richard Feynman understood and that almost nobody else does. The question isn't how to force your mind to learn. The question is why you ever thought forcing was the answer in the first place. Feynman learned this before he could articulate it. In Far Rockaway, Queens, in a small house where his father Melville sold uniforms for a living, something unusual was happening. Melville Feynman didn't teach his son. He played with him. They'd walk through the neighborhood, and Melville would ask questions. Why do birds ruffle their feathers before flying? What makes the ball curve when you throw it with spin? Why does the moon look bigger on the horizon? He never demanded correct answers. He never tested Richard afterward. He never assigned homework or checked if the lessons had been retained. What he did was show his son that the world was full of mysteries, and that noticing them was a form of joy. Not duty, not obligation. Joy. Richard would spend hours watching ants carry food, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to understand how they knew where to go. This wasn't study. This was fascination. And fascination is the thing that dies the moment you try to command it. Feynman's father knew something that modern education has forgotten entirely. Curiosity is not a tool you can pick up and use when convenient. Curiosity is a wild animal. It comes when it wants. It stays if you feed it gently. And it runs away forever the second you try to cage it. What happens in your brain when you try to force yourself to learn something you don't care about? The neuroscience is unambiguous. When genuine curiosity is present, your brain releases dopamine, not as a reward for completing the task, but as a signal that something interesting is happening. This dopamine doesn't just make you feel good. It changes the physical structure of your neural pathways, making them more receptive to new information, more likely to form lasting connections, more capable of integrating what you're learning with what you already know. Your attention sharpens, your memory consolidates. Learning happens not because you're trying, but because your brain is designed to capture and retain whatever triggers that dopamine response. But when you force yourself to study something that bores you, something you're only engaging with because you have to, because there's a test coming, or because someone said you should, the dopamine never arrives. Your brain interprets the task as a threat, not an opportunity. Cortisol rises, attention fractures, your working memory shrinks to almost nothing. And whatever you manage to stuff into your head through sheer repetition sits there temporarily, disconnected from everything else you know, waiting to be forgotten the moment the pressure lifts. You can force behavior. You can force yourself to sit in a chair and stare at a textbook for 6 hours, but you cannot force the neurochemical cascade that makes learning possible. That only happens when the mind wants to be there, and the mind cannot be commanded to want. By the time Feynman got to MIT, he was already operating on a completely different principle than his classmates. They studied with grim determination, covering every page of every assigned textbook, memorizing formulas, drilling problems until their hands cramped. Feynman studied only what interested him. If a chapter bored him, he skipped it. If a problem seemed tedious, he ignored it. If a lecture felt like a waste of time, he stopped going. And yet, consistently, semester after semester, he understood more than the students who followed every rule. His classmates would come to him baffled, asking how he could possibly grasp concepts they'd studied for hours and still couldn't comprehend. Feynman didn't have a secret technique. He had something simpler and more devastating. He only engaged with what he found genuinely interesting. And when something interested him, he didn't need discipline. He didn't need to force anything. He would work on a problem for 10 hours straight, and it would feel like 10 minutes, not because he had superior willpower, but because his brain was flooded with dopamine the entire time. He wasn't working. He was playing. And play is the original form of learning, the form we abandon the moment we enter the machinery of formal education. Feynman never abandoned it. He never accepted the premise that learning was supposed to hurt, that it was supposed to require grinding through boredom as some kind of moral test. He understood what almost nobody understands. Intensity of interest is infinitely more powerful than intensity of effort. You can study something you hate for 1,000 hours and learn nothing. You can study something you love for 10 hours and understand it forever. This is where most people fail. They confuse performance with comprehension. They memorize definitions, replicate procedures, pass exams, accumulate credentials, and never once stop to ask whether they actually understand anything. Feynman had a name for this: cargo cult education. During World War II, when American planes brought supplies to remote Pacific islands, the locals watched carefully. They saw that when the Americans built runways and control towers and wore headphones, planes arrived with food and equipment. So after the war ended and the Americans left, the islanders built their own runways out of bamboo. They built control towers out of wood. They wore coconut headphones and mimicked the movements of air traffic controllers. They did everything right, everything they'd observed, except no planes came, because they'd copied the form without understanding the function. They'd created a perfect simulation of an airport without any of the underlying knowledge that makes an airport work. This is what happens in most classrooms. Students learn to simulate understanding. They learn what answers to give, what phrases to repeat, what boxes to check. They learn the ritual without the reality. And when Feynman encountered this in his students at Caltech, it enraged him. He would ask them to explain something in their own words, and they couldn't. He would change one variable in a familiar problem, and they'd be lost. They knew how to perform the script of physics. They had no idea what physics actually was. And the reason was simple. They'd been forced to learn it. They'd memorized it under pressure, for grades, for approval, for the anxiety of not falling behind. None of them had ever experienced the pure, uncoerced fascination that makes real learning possible. They'd never been allowed to. Feynman discovered the solution to impossible problems when he stopped trying to solve them. At Los Alamos, working on the Manhattan Project, he'd sometimes hit walls. Equations that wouldn't resolve, concepts that wouldn't cohere. In those moments, he learned to do something counterintuitive. He would stop. He would go play his bongo drums. He would go to a bar and watch people. He would lie down and let his mind wander wherever it wanted. And almost always, while he wasn't thinking about the problem, while he was doing something completely unrelated, the solution would arrive. Not through effort, through release. His colleagues thought he was undisciplined. They'd see him goofing off while they worked late into the night, and they'd assume he wasn't serious. What they didn't understand was that Feynman was working, just not in the way they recognized. He'd learned that the mind does its deepest work when you stop controlling it. When you force concentration, you activate only the narrow, conscious part of your brain, the part that operates in linear steps and follows established rules. But real insight comes from the unconscious, from the vast associative network that makes unexpected connections, that sees patterns you didn't know existed, that solves problems through leaps rather than steps. And that network only activates when you stop forcing, when you relax, when you trust that your mind knows what it's doing better than your willpower does. This is the secret nobody wants to hear, because it contradicts everything we've been taught about discipline and productivity. The secret is that you learn more by letting go than by holding on. You understand more when you stop trying so hard to understand. There's a difference between wanting to know something and wanting to have known it. Most people don't want to learn. They want to possess the status that comes from having learned. They want the credential, the title, the ability to say they understand something impressive. They want to have read the great books, not to actually read them. They want to know physics, not to spend years confused and fascinated by physical phenomena. This distinction is everything. When you want to have known, learning becomes a task to be completed as efficiently as possible. You look for shortcuts, summaries, simplified explanations that let you claim understanding without doing the work of understanding. You study to pass the test, not to satisfy curiosity. You're in a hurry to arrive at knowledge so you can move on to the next thing. But when you want to know, when you're genuinely curious about something, time disappears. You're not trying to complete the task. You're exploring territory that fascinates you. You read things that aren't required. You ask questions nobody assigned. You take detours that lead nowhere except deeper into the mystery. And this is where real learning lives, not in the efficient completion of required material, but in the inefficient, meandering, obsessive pursuit of whatever captures your imagination. Feynman wanted to know. He spent his entire life wanting to know. He never wanted to have known, because that would mean the curiosity was over, and the curiosity was the only thing that mattered. When he won the Nobel Prize, people congratulated him on finally achieving the recognition he deserved. Feynman didn't care. The prize didn't teach him anything new. It didn't make physics more interesting. It was just a distraction from what he actually wanted, to keep learning forever, without ever arriving at a point where learning was finished. Watch Feynman teach. Watch recordings of his lectures at Caltech where he's explaining quantum electrodynamics to undergraduates who can barely follow. He doesn't start with equations. He starts with wonder. He describes how strange it is that light behaves the way it does, how deeply weird it is that an electron can be in two places at once, how nobody, including him, really understands why quantum mechanics works. He admits his own confusion. He shares his own fascination. And then, only then, does he introduce the mathematics, not as a set of rules to memorize, but as a language for describing the mystery. His students don't always understand the equations, but they understand something more important, that physics is alive, that it's still full of questions, that even the greatest physicist in the room is still genuinely puzzled by the universe. Feynman never forced anyone to learn because he had never forced himself to learn. He'd spent his entire life following his curiosity like a scent, and he couldn't imagine any other way to relate to knowledge. When students came to him asking how to make themselves study harder, he'd look confused. Why would you study something that requires force? Why not study something you can't stop thinking about? This answer frustrated people because most people don't have the freedom to only study what fascinates them. They have requirements, obligations, prescribed curricula. But Feynman's point wasn't that you should ignore your obligations. His point was that if you're trying to force your mind to learn something, you've already lost. You're in the wrong relationship with knowledge, and no amount of discipline will fix that. Forcing your mind to learn is violence, not metaphorical violence, actual violence against the nature of consciousness. Your mind is not a machine that processes whatever input you feed it. It's an organism with its own rhythms, its own preferences, its own mysterious logic. You cannot force sleep. If you lie in bed commanding yourself to fall asleep, you guarantee insomnia. Sleep comes only when you stop trying. You cannot force digestion. Your stomach does what it does regardless of your will. You cannot force desire or inspiration or love. And you cannot force learning. These are all processes that happen when the conditions are right, when the organism is ready, when the natural mechanism is allowed to operate without interference. But we've built an entire civilization on the premise that the mind can and should be controlled, that learning is a matter of discipline and willpower, that if you're not learning, it's because you're not trying hard enough. This is insane. This is like telling someone with insomnia to try harder to fall asleep. The trying is the problem. The force is the obstacle. Feynman understood this because he'd never been successfully trained out of his natural learning instinct. Most people, by the time they reach adulthood, have been so thoroughly conditioned by forced education that they've forgotten what it feels like to learn because they want to. They think learning is supposed to hurt. They think boredom is something to push through rather than a signal that they're in the wrong place. They've internalized the violence as virtue, and then they wonder why, after years of education, they don't understand anything, don't remember anything, don't care about anything. It's not because they're stupid. It's because they've been teaching their brains for years that learning is punishment. Late in his life, Feynman gave a series of lectures where he admitted something that shocked his audience. He said that despite a lifetime of studying physics, despite winning the Nobel Prize, despite being considered one of the greatest minds of his generation, he still didn't really understand most of it. He could do the calculations. He could predict experimental results. He could teach the theories. But the deeper he went, the more he realized how little he actually knew. Why does quantum mechanics work? He didn't know. Nobody knows. What is an electron really? He didn't know. Why do the fundamental constants have the values they have? He didn't know. And instead of hiding this ignorance or feeling ashamed of it, he celebrated it, because he understood that conscious ignorance is the highest intellectual achievement, not the ignorance of the person who never learned, the ignorance of the person who learned enough to realize how vast the mystery is. Most people can't tolerate this. They need to feel like they know things, like they've mastered something, like their years of study have produced certainty. Feynman didn't need that. He was comfortable, even joyful, in not knowing, because not knowing meant there was still more to discover. Not knowing meant the fascination wasn't over. He'd spent his entire life learning not so that he could know, but so that he could know better what he didn't know. And this, finally, is the secret. The secret isn't a method. It isn't a technique. It's a way of being. It's the willingness to remain forever in the state of curiosity, to never graduate from wonder into certainty, to never trade fascination for expertise, to keep the mind wild, untamed, free from the need to control or possess knowledge. This is what makes learning possible. Not discipline, not force, but freedom. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. What if everything you call lack of discipline is actually your mind's healthy resistance to violence? What if your inability to force yourself to study things you don't care about isn't a personal failing, but a sign that your learning instinct is still alive, still fighting back against coercion? What if the reason you can't make yourself learn is because learning doesn't work that way, has never worked that way, will never work that way, and the entire premise of forced education is a catastrophic misunderstanding of what a mind is and how it works? Feynman never figured out how to force his mind to learn. He figured out that he didn't need to. He figured out that when you stop forcing, when you stop controlling, when you stop treating your mind like an employee that needs to be managed and start treating it like a river that needs to be followed, everything changes. You don't need more discipline. You need less. You don't need to try harder. You need to try less. You need to find what fascinates you and follow it, even if it's impractical, even if it doesn't lead anywhere useful, even if nobody else understands why you care. Because that fascination is the only thing that makes learning real. Everything else is just cargo cult education. Everything else is just theater, and you can perform the theater for your entire life and never learn a single true thing, or you can stop performing. You can stop forcing. You can let curiosity, like water, find its own path. And you can discover what Feynman knew, that learning isn't something you make happen. It's something you allow. And the moment you allow it, it's already happening.